And when you're in these situations, you have to have an open mind. You have to know the principles. You have to understand combat, but then you have to be able to take those principles and apply them modulate them and utilize them in ways that they may never have been utilized before so that you can get the outcome that you desire. It's a very creative, focused job, and people miss that a lot. And that's why the training that I ran, we really focused on forcing the leaders to get creative to solve problems.
So let's talk a little about some of the leadership examples that we all have in common. So we have, the movies provide us tons of examples of what they see as good leaders. Who are some examples of leaders that you've seen in either everyday life or in politics? Some leaders that you see and you say, that's what a good leader looks like. Because we all have this sort of picture of a leader in our head that it's an Abraham Lincoln figure, tall person who kind of only speaks when necessary. Or the leader that comes to mind for me is what's the name of the actor in Band of Brothers?
I don't know the actor's name, but I know that he's trying to portray Dick Winters.
Dick Winters, exactly. So that's the image that a lot of folks have from pop culture. Who would be your leaders that you look to and you say these are the ones who I see as sort of the heroic leaders?
Yeah, I mean Dick Winters. That's a fantastic example. I've covered his books on my podcast because he's a leader that does every one of these little nuanced things. You can see him do it. And Band of Brothers is an amazing series that really shows the nuances of his leadership. So I think that's fantastic. One of the leaders that I always tried to emulate is a guy by the name of Colonel David Hackworth, who was one of the most decorated soldiers. He served in Korea and in Vietnam. And he wrote a book called About Face, which is about an 800-page book. And it's really not about leadership at all, overtly, but it's 100% about leadership as you read it and if you're looking for those lessons. But he was a guy that, again, he balanced all these dichotomies very effectively. He was completely revered by the people that worked for him. Most of the people that he worked for loved him and loved having him on their team. However, and this is part of the dichotomy, he's the guy that he's one of the first senior leaders in Vietnam that said, look, if we don't change the way we're fighting this war, we are not going to win. And they drummed him out of the army in a matter of months after that. And to me, it was him speaking the truth as he saw it, which I have great respect for.
So when you look at today's politics, obviously it's what I do for a living, and it feels extraordinarily chaotic. It feels like it's a war of all against all. It's sort of this Hobbesian state of nature. Do you see that as a lack of leadership, or is it that there are too many people who think they're leaders fighting with one another?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think we're getting accustomed to this new world where you can get reactions on a minute-by-minute basis. And one of the best ways to get reactions from people is to make statements that are extreme. And so, again, this new book, Dichotomy Leadership, it's about balance. And right now, I would say in politics, we don't find very much balance. We find people on both sides that are leaning towards the extremes all the time, and then that gets greatly amplified by the media.
How much of leadership involves actually having a group of people who have the same common goal? Because one of the big problems that I'm seeing in our politics generally, and I think this is true, just in a fragmenting society that focuses very much on the individual. I'm an individualist. I really believe that people should have the right to do essentially what they want, so long as they're not harming anyone else. But it seems like the success of a team, whether it's a Navy SEAL team or any other team, relies on having the same common goal. How much of that can be instilled by leadership, and how much of that is just, you joined the team voluntarily, you knew what you were getting into, and can that be restored if there's a lack of goal-orientedness in the society as a whole?
You have to have some kind of common goal. You absolutely do. Now, without a common goal, you don't know where you're going. Now, where we run into trouble in a team or in the political environment we're in right now is there's different ways to get to that goal. Right? There's different ways to get to that goal. I mean, I don't think there's anyone, maybe there are, but generally people want good for the world, right? There's no one that's thinking, hey, we want a dictatorship in America. There's no one no normal people are saying that, right? We all have a common goal. We want families to have good lives. We want people to be taken care of. We want you to have opportunity. We want to have a good economy, right? These are all things that are pretty standard. I don't think we're going to get fighting against that. Where we get fighting is how we're going to get there and disagreements on how we're going to get there. And then what we see is people that put a stake in the ground on their idea and don't want to listen to anyone else. And in a team environment, that's problematic. It boils down to ego, right? Hey, I'm not going to listen to your idea. I want to go with my idea. And you know what? There'll be no compromise. There'll be no compromise. We're only going to do it my way. And I would rather not execute the mission, not accomplish the mission, than not do it my way. And so when I see that, that's problematic. How do you solve it? Eventually, if you're going to move forward, you have to solve it. You have to find out what those compromises are going to be.
Yeah, and this is where I actually wonder whether that's true. Maybe I have a more pessimistic view of the country than you do actually at this point, because I do wonder whether we agree on the endpoints and we're just disagreeing about the means. I think that a lot of folks, like nobody's going to come out and say, I want a dictatorship. There are a lot of folks who will say, I would like to restrict X right for this group of people because I think that right as exercised is hurting me. No due process rights for particular sets of crime. We need to shut down this particular sort of speech because this sort of speech hurts me. At a certain point, I do wonder whether we lack even the common language of goals in order to arrive at a common destination. Are you pessimistic or optimistic about the future of the country?
I'm less pessimistic than you are with that and with those type of examples, because I don't see those as fringe. And again, I don't live in the same world as you do. I'm
in the worst of the I do politics all day. It's the
you're
worst.
In a constant firefight with this stuff. In normal American, I work with businesses all over the country. And you know what? I hate to break the news to you. Most people aren't watching news 24 hours a day. Most people aren't listening to those fringe people on either side. Most people are out there working hard, trying to make a living, trying to take care of their family. That's what it's beyond the vast majority. It is the absolute vast majority of the people that I work with every day are people that want to improve their station in life. They want to help their team win. They want to do good work. They got pride in what they're doing. That's what most people, construction, manufacturing, finance. That's what these people are doing. And so the fringe people that are out screaming and yelling, they're loud and the media focuses on them. Why? Well, it's because the media wants to get people to click and hear what that crazy person has to say. Most of America, we don't click on that stuff. We don't.
What do you think civilians don't understand about the military that you wish they understood more? Very, very few Americans actually now know somebody who serves in the military or has served in the military. It used to be that a huge percentage of Americans served. Now it's like 2% of Americans serve in the military. What do you think that civilians really ought to know about how the military operates and what the military lifestyle is like?
Well, number one, I think the most important thing to understand about people in the military is that they're people. And these are people with husbands and wives. These are people with kids. These are people with goals. And they're people with emotions. And I think sometimes when you see a picture of a soldier, of a sailor, of an airman, of a Marine, you think of them as that thing, as a soldier, as a sailor, as an airman, as a Marine. And we often forget that soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, that service member, they are a person and they have a life. And so I think that's what happens when guys come home and they don't have a new mission to focus on. They get a little bit lost and people don't know how to treat them. So I say it's real simple and straightforward. They're people. Treat them like people and give them the respect that they deserve, absolutely, because the sacrifices that they make they're not sacrifices made by a robot. They're sacrifices made by a person. And like in my case, and the families as well. In my case, when I was on my last deployment to Ramadi, I left my wife at home with 3 young kids. And I knew what I was doing. I knew what my day-to-day circumstances were. My wife didn't know. My wife was at home raising kids. And by the way, going to visit my wounded guys in the hospital, going to my guys' funerals. That is an incredible sacrifice on the home front as well. So I think it's important just to remember that these are people, both the service members and their families.
That's pretty amazing. How did you meet your wife?
I met my wife I was overseas and she was overseas, and we met in church.
Pretty good place to meet.
There was beer served at this particular church. Yeah, we met in a bar.
She sounds like a pretty amazing person. So how did she deal with all of this, with you being overseas in the middle of a battle area?
It was hard, and I think my wife I think the key component of my wife that made her, we've been married for 20-something years. I always tell her it seems like forever, but we've been married for a long time through multiple deployments overseas. And I think for her, what makes her able to cope with this is that she's emotionally independent from me. She doesn't need my phone call every day to reassure her that everything's okay. and that, I'm coming back or whatever. She's emotionally independent. And of course, she's independent and she could handle the broken water heater and the flat tire and the whatever other problems, the sick kids. She could handle all that stuff. So she's independent in that way, but she's emotionally independent as well and didn't rely on me every day to give her the boost. She's a confident, squared away woman. So
it sounds like you're obviously anti-feminist. I mean, that's as a former member of the military. It seems obviously. I mean, that's what we all assume. That's the
I have 3 daughters and one son, and my daughters are I wrote a couple books about kids books called Warrior Kid, Way of the Warrior Kid, and it's about kids. Instead of accepting weakness, it's about kids trying to become stronger, which to me seems like a pretty fundamental thought. But if you read a lot of kids books and you have kids, you probably see them. There's not a lot of kid books that actually tell kids that, hey, what you want to do is you want to work hard and you want to be stronger and you want to be the best that you can be. So I did that with my kids and I wrote these kids books for them. But yeah, my daughters are absolute warrior kids and now they're warrior adults. But
so you bring a lot of lessons from the military to the civilian area. Have you learned anything in sort of the business area that you think would be applicable to the military? Well, what have you learned in civilian life that you think added to what you already knew from your service?
The biggest and most shocking thing that I learned about the civilian sector was that leadership is leadership. And the same problems that a company with 1,000 employees would have are literally the same problems that a SEAL platoon with 16 guys would have. And learning that and beginning to understand, it didn't take me very long at all. As soon as I was sitting down with the first CEO I ever worked with, and he started telling me the problems they were having, and I just, inside I was just chuckling, saying, you got to be kidding me. I've seen this over and over again with a SEAL platoon. Here's what the issue is. Let's address it this way. So that was the biggest lesson learned for me is leadership is leadership is leadership.
So you're a pretty intense dude. You're the only person I've ever had on this podcast who probably speaks as quickly as I do. So have you always been like that, or is that something that's gotten you into trouble? How was this something that you cultivated, or you were always this intensive person?
No, if you listen to my podcast, you'll find that I actually talk very slowly generally. But it depends. Sometimes you got to get your point across. And, I know your audience is probably pretty quick paced. They don't want to hear my slow talk. And again, on my podcast, I'm usually dealing with very heavy subjects. I talk about war and I talk about atrocities. And really it's a podcast about human nature through the lens of leadership. And so the subjects are heavy. Sometimes that warrants a little bit more nuance when I'm talking. But yeah, I guess if I'm talking as fast as you, that's a scary thought.
So what do you think it is about human nature? So let's talk about that a little bit. What do you see human beings as? What is our fundamental nature? Because this is what all of politics is about.
Yeah. Again, one of the most interesting things about human nature is that all human beings are completely different, and yet all human beings are kind of the same. And one thing that you find is that through war and through atrocities is you get to see human nature be revealed. And what I do with the podcast, from my perspective, the better you understand human nature, the better you can lead people, because you've got to understand where they're coming from. You got to understand how their ego is going to react to things. You got to understand, like you said earlier, when people get defensive, how do you get around that? You got to understand what people don't like to expose. You got to understand how they're going to interact with other people, how they're going to come across when you get aggressive or not aggressive enough. So the better you understand human nature, the better you're going to be able to lead. And one of the things, I was just at West Point, as a matter of fact, and I was talking to the soldiers to be up there. And one of the things I was talking about was the fact that I said, listen, you take a platoon, an Army, a Marine Corps infantry platoon, a SEAL platoon. Inside that platoon, you've got a person in there that's a sadist. They're in there. You've got some people, you've got another person that is one of the most wholesome, good people you could ever imagine. You got both of them, and you got every person in between. And if you don't understand that as a leader, if you don't understand what these individuals that work for you are capable of, then that's going to be problematic when you're in a leadership position. So understanding human nature, understanding that there's good and there's evil inside of everyone, and everyone's capable of going in those directions. I covered the My Lai massacre on my podcast, and when I was up at West Point, I was talking and I got looks from the crowd, from some of the actual current leaders from the crowd. Was kind of like, wait, what do you mean? We don't have a sadist. We don't have a murderer in a platoon. And I said, think about the My Lai massacre.